So the first best AFL fantasy website / resource is this one. It's called DFS Australia. So if you Google DFS Australia, you'll find it. And apart from the official platform, which everyone uses to play fantasy, this is the best website in my opinion. There's a couple of really good features, and Mortz, who's behind it, has done a fantastic job. It's completely free, unlike some other fantasy resources. He gives you the option to donate and support, but the amount of information on here and the way that it's organised is fantastic if you're interested in fantasy footy. And it's very important for knowing what role particular players are playing. It's very good for seeing how they've gone in the VFL or SANFL, and it's good for seeing what particular teams give up in points, who's hard to score against, who's easy to score against. So this is a homepage, and then it's not really the homepage, but this is the homepage, and then if you click on the AFL tab, it'll take you to this page, which is where all the good stuff is. And then personally, my most visited would be centre bounce attendances, kick-ins, ruck contests. If we click on centre bounce attendances, as we sort of know, we should know in fantasy, the best players and the majority of your team is going to be centre bounce midfielders. And if we click on this, it'll show the centre bounce attendances for each team as a percentage of total centre bounces. So for Adelaide, Riley O'Brien's averaging 84% of their centre bounces, which would be his time on ground. The 16% would be when he's off for a rest. Rory Laird, 78%. Sam Berry, 58%. Dawson, 50%. But you can see not just their average, but the trend. So Dawson had no centre bounces in the first 2 weeks, and then he's become pretty much a full-time midfielder after that. Josh Rochelle, you can see, has been in and out a little bit. Ben Keys plays more midfield because he's tagging Nick Dacos, who's playing in the midfield. It's just good to look at these sort of trends, and you can also see how certain players affect each other. So when Schoenberg's in the team, Rochelle's centre bounces are lower, so are Dawson's. And Sam Berry gets lower centre bounces, Rochelle gets more. You can kind of see these correlations between the players, and I'll just touch on an example that I want to highlight for a later section where I'm going to talk about some of the trade targets and trade out players. So we can see here, Will Setterfield, he had his lowest score for the year on the weekend, but he's averaging 71% centre bounces. He had 68%, so his role hasn't changed. If anything, Stringer's come in a little bit. Well, Stringer's centre bounces have changed a lot, so that potentially could be affecting Setterfield. We've seen it affect his score, but Geelong are a very good team and they're quite restrictive with points. His role hasn't actually changed. He's still in there, and if anything, Merritt looks to be the one that was affected the most by Stringer. So I wouldn't be jumping at shadows with Setterfield. You check that his role is still the same, and at the end of the day, he's averaging 97, and I feel like he could be a Will Brodie of this season, where you trade him out because of the price you paid for him. You're not valuing him as highly as you could if you paid, say, $800K for him. This is the first best fantasy resource for me. The other thing that they've got, which is really, really cool, is this defense first position. So if we click on that and then scroll down, it's been organized into different positions. So you've got your key forwards, which you don't really pick. General forwards also don't really pick. Inside midfielders, which is very important. Rucks, very important. Wing defenders, which is very important. It's wingers and halfback flankers that push up the ground. General defenders is basically key defenders and defenders that don't get a heap of the footy normally, and designated kicker is just the one that takes the kick-ins. And looking at this, the first number is the average points difference compared to a player's average score for the season. So North Melbourne are giving up on average 10 more points to general forwards than those general forwards have averaged against every other team. Port Adelaide are giving up 13 more points, and even more stuck, West Coast are giving up 21 more points on average to ruckman than every other team in the competition. Or it's not necessarily every other team in the competition, it's every other team that ruck has played. So on the weekend, who did West Coast play? Richmond. They would have had Ivan Soldo, or Port Adelaide is probably a better example. So Port Adelaide on the weekend played St Kilda. Rowan Marshall in the ruck. He scored 159, his top score of the year. And that just adds to the case that Rowan Marshall scored higher than his average. And on average, the players against Port Adelaide in the ruck, have scored 13 points more than their average. I've butchered that a little bit, but basically the number in front is how much more than normal players are scoring, and the percentage next to it is what percentage of players in this position score above their average. So pretty straightforward, just good to have a look at. Personally, I just really look at inside mids and rucks, and then your defenders. So you can see Hawthorn, St Kilda, Western Bulldogs, St Kilda and Western Bulldogs in particular, giving up a lot of points to the kick-ins, to general defenders, and to wing defenders. And for inside mids, it's West Coast, North Melbourne, Hawthorn, and yeah, Ruckman, Port Adelaide, West Coast Eagles. Got pretty inexperienced rucks in there. And then Collingwood, now that Darcy Cameron's gone down. So that's the first best fantasy resource. The next best one is this website, which is Wheelo Ratings. Once again, when you're on Wheelo Ratings, you want to go to the AFL tab and then down to player stats. It's just reloading now. I like this because it just gives you can do this on DFS Australia. I just like the interface a little bit better here. It gives you a good bulk stats display, and you can quickly filter it by anything. So if we go fantasy points average, it'll filter it by fantasy points. We can see Clayton Oliver. You can see the matches played, the age, the teams. You can also see coaches' votes and super coach ratings side by side, which is helpful because someone like an Aaron Hall, Brody Kemp's only played one game. He's averaging 107 in fantasy, but his super coach score is a little bit lower, and his player rating is a little bit lower. Similarly, Aaron Hall, so his fantasy score is huge. Super coach score not that high, particularly for a defender, and his rating is actually quite low. So that shows potentially he's not actually doing that much with the footy, and maybe he will be out of the side sooner rather than later. But I still think he's a tempting option, and one that I'll get to a little bit later. You also can have a look at like contested possession percentage, see how, I guess, sustainable each player's scoring is going to be. And then you can have a really close look at the centre bounce attendances, centre bounce percentage. So if we have a look at the fantasy points and look through the centre bounces, you can see that the only players that are averaging less than about 50% centre bounces are defender halfbacks. So we'll see Nick Dacos averaging 19% centre bounces, but he's playing off halfback, taking kick-ins, getting a lot of sort of easier ball across halfback, but the rest of them are all very high centre bounce usage players. Aaron Hall, once again, no centre bounces, but taking kick-ins. Brody Kemp, I think he's a little bit of an anomaly because he's only played the one game. We'll see if it's sustainable, but yeah, you can see that centre bounces are quite a good indicator for what players are going to at least have the potential to score well. The next one would be the team statistics. So same website, Willow Ratings. You just jump across one to team stats. And this is cool because you can see what teams are averaging the most fantasy points. So St Kilda and Carlton. St Kilda moving the ball a lot quicker than Carlton, but still getting lots of disposals, which is interesting. Carlton, is pretty obvious to see why they would be the highest fantasy scoring team with all of the marks that they take. And then interestingly, down the bottom, Brisbane, who have been one of the highest scoring fantasy teams, are right down the bottom with like West Coast and North Melbourne. So it shows that they're not really mucking around with the footy, being a lot more efficient, and potentially that's why Dunkley hasn't reached the heights that a lot of people expected of him. The other thing that you can look at is see roughly what style particular teams play and whether that suits the players in their team. So if we go along, what I like to look at, basically to look at game style, is how many marks, how many tackles, and the percentage, or how many stoppages there are, and the percentage of contested possession in each game. So who's having the most ruck contests? West Coast, Brisbane. West Coast, I think, is mainly on the back of them just being in really high scoring games because they're conceding so many points. But Adelaide, Brisbane, Bulldogs, Geelong, quite strong inside mids, forcing repeat stoppages, lots of tackles. And then down the bottom, if we're looking at teams that aren't getting involved in many ruck contests, it's North Melbourne. They like chipping the ball around. St Kilda, they're happy to go really fast. They don't want stoppages, and they're also happy to let their opposition chip the ball around. Essendon, likewise, defends similarly to St Kilda, roll back pretty hard and happy to let the opposition have lots of uncontested possession in their back line. So you can use this to kind of look at matchups ahead of time. And as mentioned before, if we look at total marks, yeah, Carlton, St Kilda taking lots of marks. Carlton probably going sideways. St Kilda going forward a little bit more than that. And this is where we've seen a little bit of a swap in Adelaide's game style. So they are third currently for marks in the competition. Last year they were close to bottom for marks. So there's been a little bit of a shift there. They've really taken their game forward, winning a lot more of the footy and using the footy with their ball movement a lot more, whereas last year they were very low marks, very low possession actually, very high tackles. And if we just find the tackles tab, I'll be able to... Yeah, here we go, defence. So the highest tackling team, Port, Sydney, and right down the bottom, it normally correlates pretty strongly. So Essendon, St Kilda, North Melbourne, as we saw before, happy to let the opposition have lots of the footy, be involved in high marking games and low ruck contest games. You can also look at opposition averages. And this is helpful with fantasy points too, so you can see the teams that are the most restrictive in Collingwood, Adelaide, Geelong, Port Adelaide, Melbourne. Teams that win a lot of the footy on the inside and are just pretty good at controlling, put on a lot of pressure. And then down the bottom, the teams that give up the most points are obviously your worst teams, but then someone like a St Kilda and a North Melbourne that defends quite deep. Western Bulldogs, Richmond. Yeah, it's just interesting to look at. Starting to drone on and on a little bit, so I'll get this moving, but these are just two of the best resources for me. Next up is just looking at the fixture. It seems obvious, but particularly with captains and rookies and choosing who you're going to put on field, I think this is very important. Obviously, opposition, location, and stadium. Marvel Stadium, not really as much of an issue with the weather, but I think you just need to look at who they're playing against and where they're playing, and potentially the stadium as well, but in particular the location. And then we'll get to the next thing, which I think is just a weather forecast. This is like something that I think a few fantasy coaches do, but probably something you should do a little bit more is if you've got someone in your team that's a keeper and you're going to be having them in your team for the rest of the season, don't really worry about it because you can't really change your decisions. But if you're looking at someone for a captain, or you're looking to bring someone in, or you're deciding between rookies, check the weather for the game that they're playing on the weekend. So Gold Coast, I was having a look at this for the Suns game. They play on Saturday and it looks like it's going to be pretty clear. 24 degrees, no rain at all. A little bit of wind, not much wind either. So it's going to be really good conditions, maybe a little bit of dew, but I think potentially in winter not even so much dew as there normally is. But if you're looking at a game and it's going to be raining, you don't want any halfbacks in that game. You want midfielders who are going to get lots of tackles. That was the case when Rory Laird scored his 160 and broke the tackle record last year. That was a wet game. So pick players who do well, like rucks in the wet tend to do pretty well if they're tap ruckman, like a Jared Witts, whereas someone who's better at marking around the ground, like a Tim English, although he's elevated his game and he's a very well-rounded player now, but lighter framed players don't tend to play as well in the wet. You want guys that are tougher, that score from tackles, stuff like that. Okay, I think that's resources done. Next up, looking at my team from round 7. So I'll really briefly touch on it and then get into some of the most traded in and traded out players and give my thoughts on each of them. As I mentioned, I don't know if I did mention it actually, these videos are going to be a little bit longer and it's basically going to combine the review and the trade video. Give my thoughts on the players that I think are top of mind for most people and the ones that most people are considering trading in or out. I hope that'll be a little bit more helpful. And if I miss anyone, you want like my thoughts, whatever they're worth on a particular player, then just comment on the video and I'll get back to you with a very well worded response, obviously. So Dacos, lowest score of the year, got tagged, still scored 99. So obviously we're not concerned about him. He's definitely going to be a top defender. Dawson, another good game. Disappointing, obviously, with the loss for the Crows, but he's another one who's a lock for a top defender playing midfield time. He's getting tackles and marks and winning possessions. He's fantastic. McGrath and Ridley continue to be so disappointing, and one of them's going to go this week. Hopefully the other one will go the week after, but terrible. I'll just touch on something quickly. So with McGrath, he's averaging 75, but then if we look, his highest score is 88. So it's not like he even has the capacity to turn his season around with a couple of big scores because he hasn't even gone above 90 yet. And that's a big red flag for me and a warning sign. Comes up against a team that is very restrictive with their fantasy points, generally playing at home. So, yeah, alarm bells going off everywhere. Ridley has scored 100, but average is only a tiny bit higher than McGrath. Now, Jinby, we'll get to him in the traded out section. At 50, I think he's reliable as an on-field rookie. Looked like he had to play a little bit more key defense. Oh, sorry, no, that was the week before. This game, I think he had lots of tackles. Yeah, so he's got his tackling back up, which is good. That's what we want from his game. And the lower disposals, very high handball numbers are what we've sort of come to expect. Not really getting on the outside very much, but the inside ball, and they just need him in there at the moment. So I think the time is probably right to move him on if you've got a suitable replacement. And Will Day came back into the team after his 2-match suspension and was straight back to his best. 30 touches, started the game even faster than that, was on track for more, high possession, and he's just a really good player. I was worried, didn't know what the mix would be like, but I think now you've seen it again. If you're keen on Will Day, he's one to potentially jump on. Seamus Mitchell, I watched his highlights from this game. I thought he was really impressive. He got subbed out, so only played 40% game time. I don't know if he's not defending, because you can't see that on the vision. It's just his involvement, his possessions. So I'm not sure if he's letting his man run off and kick heaps of goals, but he looked. I was really impressed. It wasn't like, oh, this guy's okay. He did some really nice things. I like his instincts. He just looks like a natural player. And then Wilmot, obviously, as is always the case, bounces back from his lowest score of the year with probably his highest score. I've got a couple of GWS guys in here looking to round out that midfield at some point. So Kelly, he was going pretty slow. And to be honest, I'm regretting that pick a little bit. I think it was, a little bit of a hype pick and a guy that I could afford, one I could have potentially saved a little bit more money. Oh, that was the decision I was making between him and Oliver. So in hindsight, probably get the guy that you know is going to be a top mid, whereas Kelly, I think probably, yeah. When all the guys are there, it doesn't look like he's having as much of an impact. Tom Green, another one who came back from suspension with a bang, so you've got to be really happy with that. And for everyone that held, I think you'd be justified in that decision. Horn Francis, again, like Wilmot, came back from his worst score of the season with a massive score and was huge. He had 7 clearances at quarter time, which is incredible. Finished with 11 for the game for a second-year player. He's so damaging. He's just such a natural stoppage player, which is very valuable. Setterfield, I've touched on. His role hasn't changed. He just had a down game, which you've got to expect, but he's a very valuable on-field contributor at the moment, still averaging 97, which is good. Warple, another 100, so another player that we're really happy with, basically, as a mid-pricer. He's continuing to perform and looks like he's working into games more and more now as that inside midfielder, and he scored with Will Day back in the team, which is what we love to see. Led, got involved with marks, which is good. As I mentioned before, Adelaide was a very high stoppage, high tackle team last year, which suited him. He averaged 8 tackles a game, I think 8 or 9. But this year they're winning the ball more, getting it more on the outside, and he's starting to get involved, as he used to do as a halfback, with the marks around the ground. So I like that. I like to see players that are capable of scoring in a number of different ways, depending on which way the game goes. And then Ashcroft, kicked goal of the year, 100%. That is goal of the year, the one that he kicked against Freo. The degree of difficulty, the instinct, yeah. At some stage I'm going to go down to the Oval and have a go at that goal. But what you got to remember is when you're attempting that goal, you already know what you're going to do and you've planned it out. He had to make that decision so quickly. And yeah, he's a player. I thought he probably wasted the footy a little bit and chased kicks, but the more I'm watching of him, he's got some unbelievable traits. he's so quick. That's the thing, and that's what you want with a fantasy player. He's just so quick at getting the footy and getting rid of it. And like, he never gets caught with it, and he clearly makes very, very fast decisions. Sometimes I think he kicks the ball when he could pause and give a handball. He'll just rush a kick forward, but he does still get the ball moving. And I think he's going to be, obviously he's going to be a good player. Yeah, genius talent scout over here. The number one pick favourite is going to be a good player. So, Chincotta's another one. This is where we like to look at the scoring. So last week, 24 disposals, or the week before, 24 disposals, 7 marks, 1 tackle for a 76. This week he scored the same. He's only had 17 touches, but he's bumped his tackles way up against West Coast, who surprisingly giving a lot of tackles to the opposition, which you wouldn't expect them to win the footy that much, but potentially when they are winning it, they're rushing lots of ineffective disposals under physical pressure, which is what counts as a tackle, is if you're applying physical pressure, touching a player, and they turn over the footy, or it's an ineffective disposal, so turnover or stoppage, and that will count as a tackle. So happy with him, happy to have a run with him on field, but realistically, I'll probably look at a loophole. Loopholing, another thing I'll touch on quickly, because someone asked a question about it, and I think everyone should know this. Something that I didn't find out until a little bit later in my fantasy career, albeit it's been quite short. So this was probably 2 years ago I found out about it. Basically, loopholing is when you use the rolling lockout and the emergency or vice captain function combined with having non-playing players. You use that, and it basically lets you decide after the fact, once you've seen a player's score, it lets you decide whether you want to keep that score on field or whether you want to use that score as your captain score. It gives you 2 shots basically at a captain score, and it gives you 2 shots at what rookie you want to put on field. So for this weekend, Chincotta plays the first game of the round against Brisbane. If I was going to loophole him, I might have to move, jump forward. Chincotta plays oh no, I've done my trades already. Gonna have to roll back my team. This is a debacle. Wait, have I? Yeah, I must have, because he's... I don't know where the rollback button is. And now he's in defense. Okay, so I'll chuck him there for now. That doesn't make sense, so I'll have to go there. Right. Chincotta plays the first game of the not the season. He does play the first game of the season if he plays for Carlton, but he plays the first game of the round against Brisbane. If I want to have a sort of second chance with him, I put him on the bench as the emergency. Matthew Johnson is suspended for this week, so he's not playing. If Chincotta scores well and I want to use his score, I'll put Matthew Johnson on field. He's not playing. When he doesn't play, Chincotta's score will count. If I don't want to take Chincotta's score, I leave Matthew Johnson on the bench, put Jimby on field, who's playing, presumably. Then Jimby's score will obviously count because he's on field. That's how you do the emergency loophole. A sort of extension of that is the vice-captain loophole. A lot of people did this with Rowan Marshall, and having a non-playing R3, it's pretty helpful. So, for this week, I'm not sure who I'm looking at. The St Kilda North Melbourne game is the last game of the round, which is good. You want your non-playing player to be in one of the later games so that you can still adjust them after you've seen these scores. But what's an early game? Roy Laird playing at GMHBA, narrow ground, hopefully high tackle, high possession game that suits him. He did quite well there last year, but he did well everywhere last year. So I put the vice-captain on Laird, the captain on Steele. If Laird scores 120 and I want to take his score, then all I have to do is put the captaincy on a player who's not playing and put an emergency on someone on the bench. So Roy Laird scores really well. Max Heath isn't going to play. I put Max Heath on field. I make Max Heath captain, and I make sure to put the emergency on Ron Marshall, which is something I forgot to do 2 weeks ago, and haven't forgotten about it. So obviously it burns deeply with me. So that is the vice captain loophole. And if you don't want to take Roy Laird's score, you leave the vice captain on him, and then your captain's score will count, who has to play afterwards. The most important thing with this is just getting the order right. So if your non-playing player plays before the emergency, they'll be locked out and you won't be able to move them on field. If your captain plays before your vice captain, that won't work. If the other way you can get into trouble with this is you want to take a score, but all of your emergencies are locked out, and it means that you'll have a non-playing player as the emergency, and you'll get a 0 on score, which obviously isn't desirable. So what you've got to consider when weighing up these options, in this instance, it's good with Heath and Marshall playing late because you've got a playing emergency and a non-playing player on field. But for some of these midfield ones, depending on whether it's locked out or not, you might have to consider whether you take a good captain score and a bad emergency score, or roll the dice with another captain and roll the dice with a different rookie on field. It's just the way the game works, basically. Moving on. Most traded out players. Jimby, as I touched on before, he's getting close to maxing out in price, but I wouldn't trade him unless you've got someone that's as good or not, if not better, to put on field, because he should really be on field. Defender, midfield, flexible status. If he doesn't score above 65 this week, 60 odd, then definitely time to get rid of him, especially with Chincotta and a couple of other guys potentially being eligible in that position to bring in. Setterfield, don't jump too early on him. He could really turn around his season and still be a very good player. And if he's the worst player in your team, you'll be coming first by a long way, because he's not the worst player in anyone's team. Philippa, I think this one is a pretty good option. He just handballs so much. He doesn't get marks, doesn't get tackles, so he's not scoring as well as he could from the amount he's actually getting involved in the game. Cam McKenzie, I traded him out last week, but looks like he's just been pushed out of that Hawthorn midfielder. Young player, will probably get opportunities later in the year. That tends to be the sort of cycle with these young guys, is they'll debut round 1, play 5 or 6, get dropped, get rested, come back later in the year. Don't give up on him if he gets picked later in the year, but I think it's time to go for now. And Fergus Green, this is one where I think it makes perfect sense. Mitch Lewis came back into the team. Fergus Green was building form nicely. Mitch Lewis comes back into the team and his score falls off a cliff. He scored 19 after back-to-back 70s. So I think time to move on him, be proactive. Andrew McGrath, I wish I could be getting rid of him. Maybe I'll get rid of him this week. But yeah, it's a little bit similar to the Setterfield one. His role hasn't changed, but he's just been a failed pick from the start. And if you can, say, downgrade a rookie and trade McGrath up to a defender that's averaging 100, that is a good move. The difference is, with Setterfield, he's averaging 97. So you'd have to be getting him to Oliver to make it worthwhile. And even then, I think you'd be better served trading out someone who's going a little bit worse. So McGrath, even though he's a failed pick, he's averaging 75, which is good to have on field. It's tough when you have to sit there and look at these failed picks week after week, just be mediocre. Davey came back in, but yeah, he's not a high scoring type player, even though he's very, very skillful. Phillips similarly named out this week. Cowan named out this week. A lot of these are just guys that have debuted. In the case of Phillips, he's coming back from injury, but still a pretty young player. And then they've made their way out of the team. I think if guys get dropped, trade them out immediately. If they're rookies, you don't want non-playing rookies on your field. The only exception is if they're just suspended or rested for a week. But it's hard to tell if they're rested when they're so young. Long, another one not playing. Trade him out. Hollins, I traded him out probably a couple of weeks too early, but realistically, he's not going to generate that much more cash. Although he probably did. So he scored 66 and 75 before that. He's one guy who has elite endurance and potentially will be able to run out more of a season than your average rookie. And then Duncan, feel sorry. People jumped on him after a good score. I think, if anything, this isn't the week to trade him out because he's cheap enough that you're not really getting much for him. And apparently Adelaide are looking at a tag on Tom Stewart, so if that happens, Mitch Duncan might be the one to get off the chain, and then Darcy Wilmot, another rookie who's basically maxed out. Liam Baker, very interesting. His scores have dropped. They dropped when Rioli came back into the team, and then they've dropped again, or continued to drop when Jaden Short has come back into the team. And Jaden Short looks like he's playing that defender, sort of kick-in main distributor role over both Rioli and Baker, which is interesting and makes him a good option. Doesn't have defensive status at the moment, which is the only potential issue, but still probably a value midfielder. And then as for who people are bringing in, Rory Atkins is the most popular. He basically came in and is playing a little bit of the role that Constable did, that halfback that just gets involved in chip around play, basically. They've got Lockie Weller there, who's more your ball mover. Atkins is more just there to relieve pressure, but he actually did a few, composed, clever things with the footy. His experience, this isn't a guy in his second year. He came over from the Suns at the end of came over from the Crows to the Suns at the end of 2017, I think, on a 4-year deal, big deal, and just been playing in the reserves ever since. So he knows how to play AFL. A long time ago, I thought he potentially could be a decent player, but he's one that's just got his opportunity after doing quite well in the VFL, and with Tuke Miller going out of the team. The thing is, though, Constable came in, he was playing this role, he's out of the side, they're chopping and changing a little bit. The only one left to come into the Suns' defence would be Connor Buderick, because Will Powell's in there, Weller's come back in, so there's not that much to be concerned about. I think Buderick's still out for quite a while longer. Weller had an unbelievable recovery, so I think Rory Atkins probably holds for a little bit longer, and he's a good option. For me, a risky option, but at his price, it's not a massive risk, and particularly if he's named, you can get one of these rookies who's maxed out in price, like a Wilmot straight to him, or a Philippou straight to him, and then you can play him on field, because if he plays, he will average 75-80, which is a really good on-field score. The Suns are chipping the ball around a lot in the back line. Fiorini, he's one I think could be fool's gold a little bit, fool's gold on the Gold Coast. Low centre bounces. So he only had 12% centre bounces. He's not getting the midfield time from Tuke Miller. He just took lots of marks on the weekend, as did a lot of guys. I think potentially these two players have pretty comparable output. And Fiorini's got a little bit more job security, but he's a lot more expensive. So I'd be going Atkins out of the two. Angwin, he's I think a second or third, but definitely second, at least year midfielder, winger. Giants seem to really like him, and they've been trying to get him in the team for a while now. He was named emergency. I think he debuted last year, but just wasn't quite up for it. So obviously the Giants staff like him, even though there's a new coach, but he's a winger. He's going to be quite low scoring. So if we look at Ollie Hollands, he's probably best case scenario for Angwin, but he is cheap, and I think he probably holds his position for a while. Chincotta touched on, he held his position and still scored with Bossard and Doherty in the team, but that was a high scoring game against the Eagles. Nick Newman also went huge. Day touched on, looks like he's going and getting back to the form he showed at the start of the year pretty immediately, which is awesome. In Kemp, I just want to see another game from Kemp. There's a lot of guys back there, and the game against the Eagles was not, I don't think, representative of what the rest of the season will look like. Walsh, okay, this is another one I want to touch on with scoring. So his first game was against Adelaide, where they got ambushed at Adelaide Oval. They were down by 50 points at quarter time. Very, very contested game. Adelaide bullied them basically around the footy, had great plans, stopped Cripps, stopped Hewitt. He only had 6 kicks, 19 handballs. This is his first game back after back surgery. 7 tackles and 4 marks. So he's just eager to get involved and kicked a goal where his team was smashed. Then against St Kilda, very uncontested game. Carlton had the ball for the majority of this game. He has 38 touches, 9 marks. So he's just running up and down the ground, getting involved. Less tackles, obviously, because it's an uncontested game. And then this week, his team had a massive win. So they've been smashed. He's got involved, 25 touches, marks, tackles. He's working hard. This game, his team lost a close one, uncontested game, high disposals. He's just working into space, high marks, low tackles. And then this week, his team demolished the Eagles. Once again, 10 tackles. So he's not just a guy who's running into open space, getting the marks when Carlton are in that style of game. He's also getting involved with tackles when the game requires that. So I think that's just really good at what we want to see as far as sustainable scoring. Tom Stewart, he was a guy that I was definitely bringing in this weekend until I saw the news about the potential Ben Keys tag. it just worries me a little bit. And with something like that, it shouldn't really discourage me, because if he doesn't get tagged, it could blow up in my face. But it was either him or Steele, and I was going to get the other in the next week. This news of a tag is just enough to change my mind and get in Steele potentially this week, and then Stewart next week. His break even is 70 odd. Hopefully, if Keys does a good job, he roughly hits that, holds his price, and I can bring him in the week after, because I think he's going to be a top 6 defender and is still relatively underpriced. Steele is one of the more traded in players. And then Josh Weddle, who he had a lot of hype in the preseason. He's a very physically mature draftee. Even though he's first-year player, very physically mature. He's very much a utility. Played key defence in the under-18s, but then he's got fantastic endurance, so it looks like they want to use him on the wing. He had played in the practice match against Geelong, where they got smashed, just looked completely lost. But a lot of much better wingers and much more experienced wingers have gone to GMHBA against Geelong and looked completely lost. It's a very narrow ground. Geelong are a good team, and they're very restrictive. So he's gone back to the VFL and come in. He scored 55, but just be wary, because he only had 8 touches. 5 marks, 5 tackles is awesome, but the very, very best players, fantasy players in the comp that are 25, 26, mature bodies, they average 5 marks, 5 tackles. So the 8 touches is concerning, and I'm not sure his scoring will be sustainable. Also, great matchup for defenders/wingers against the Bulldogs. So Freo will try and control the ball a little bit more, and I can't see him keeping up this form. That's pretty much everyone. Tom Green already touched on a little bit, and McPherson actually thinks it's a good option, particularly if you bring him in as a forward, because he looks like he's got that role now. With Constable out of the team, Atkins is in there, but I think Atkins will get dropped before McPherson does, so he's almost got a bodyguard who'll go 4 before him. Ramsden, I'm not sure, 28, yeah, I wouldn't really be looking at him. These young rucks that come in, especially with the amount of competition at Hawthorn, it's a tough position to play early in your career. And then Oliver, if you can afford him, get him in for sure. Yeah, Oliver, I think Oliver, Walsh, and Steele are the 3 guys for me. I've got Laird in. I'm pretty happy with that. But Oliver, Walsh, and Steele are the 3 guys that I think are definitely going to be top 8, probably top 4 mids. Really solid captain options, so they're targets over the next couple of weeks. That brings me to what I'm doing with trades this week. So this is one particular option that I've looked at. Philippou, who's maxed out to Atkins, and Ridley up to Steele. Like Steele's matchup against North Melbourne, giving up heaps of points, but even if they weren't, he looks like he's getting back to his best. We didn't quite see it. We saw 200s to start the season, with like trademark, basically 25 touches, 5 marks, 5 tackles. That's basically what he does. And then he missed with that AC joint, came back very slowly against Carlton, who were controlling most of the footy, but again, 5 marks, 5 tackles. And then against Port, he looks like he's really getting back to his best. He laid some big tackles, a goal and a behind, so getting forward. But I think St Kilda being a high-scoring team will be suited to him. And I think he could get back to his 110 comfortably, even maybe more than that. So I think out of those guys, there's him, there's Walsh, and then there's Oliver. I'd be looking at Walsh and Steele just because they're a little bit cheaper, and I think they potentially could match Oliver, although Oliver is a freak and looks like he's hungrier than ever for the footy. So those are my trades. Those are my thoughts on guys that are popular at the moment. Longer video. Really hope you enjoy it, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.